By the end of the Bronze Age, the political map of Anatolia had fractured, leaving behind a landscape of abandoned centers, disrupted trade routes, and emerging regional powers competing for control. Between approximately 2000 and 1200 BCE, the region of Western Anatolia, later known as Lydia, formed part of a broader and interconnected Bronze Age world that extended across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. This landscape was defined not by a single unified state, but by a network of regional polities shaped by geography, resource distribution, and shifting political alliances. Its position between the Anatolian plateau and the Aegean coast made it a transitional zone, linking inland empires with maritime trade systems. Archaeological evidence from the Hermus River Valley, particularly at the site of Sardis, indicates that settlement in this region was already established by the early 2nd millennium BCE. Excavations have revealed layers of habitation, including domestic structures, storage facilities, and early fortifications. These findings suggest a stable agrarian base supported by fertile alluvial plains. The Hermus and Caister river systems provided consistent water supply, enabling grain cultivation and livestock management. This agricultural productivity formed the foundation for population growth and sustained habitation over several centuries. The geological composition of the region further contributed to its long-term economic significance. Surveys conducted along the Pactolus River have identified natural deposits of electrum, an alloy of gold and silver occurring in river sediments. While systematic coin production would not emerge until much later, the presence of precious metals in accessible form likely encouraged early extraction and exchange. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of metallurgical activity in western Anatolia, including crucibles and slag deposits, indicating that metalworking was already an established practice during the Bronze Age. These resources positioned the region within wider exchange networks that connected Anatolia to both Mesopotamia and the Aegean. Textual evidence from the Hittite Empire provides further insight into the political structure of Western Anatolia during this period. Hittite diplomatic and military records, preserved in cuneiform tablets from the capital at Hattusa, frequently refer to a region known as Arzua. This term appears to describe a coalition or grouping of Western Anatolian states that operated beyond direct Hittite control but remained within its sphere of influence. Records indicate periodic conflict between the Hittite kings and the rulers of Arzua, suggesting that Western Anatolia functioned as a semi-independent frontier zone. According to Hittite texts dating to the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, rulers such as Mursalai II conducted military campaigns into Arzuan territory to reassert authority. These campaigns are documented in royal annals, which describe the capture of cities, the deportation of populations, and the installation of loyal rulers. However, the recurring need for such campaigns indicates that Hittite control over the region was neither permanent nor fully centralized. Instead, power appears to have been negotiated through a combination of military intervention and diplomatic agreements. Archaeological findings support this interpretation of fragmented political authority. Material culture across Western Anatolia during the Late Bronze Age shows regional variation in pottery styles, burial practices, and architectural forms. Sites along the Aegean coast display influences from Mycenaean Greece, including imported ceramics and locally produced imitations. Inland settlements, by contrast, retain stronger continuity with central Anatolian traditions. This diversity suggests that Western Anatolia was not culturally uniform but instead consisted of overlapping spheres of influence shaped by trade and interaction. Trade networks played a central role in maintaining these connections. Evidence from shipwrecks, such as the Ulubran wreck dated to the late 14th century BCE, demonstrates the extent of maritime exchange in the eastern Mediterranean. Cargo recovered from the site includes copper ingots, tin, ivory, glass, and luxury goods originating from multiple regions. While the wreck itself was found off the southern coast of Anatolia, it reflects a broader system in which Western Anatolia likely participated. Overland routes linking the interior to coastal ports would have facilitated the movement of goods between inland producers and maritime traders. The strategic location of Western Anatolia made it particularly sensitive to shifts in these broader systems. By the late 13th century BCE, evidence begins to indicate increasing instability across the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological layers at multiple sites show signs of destruction, abandonment, or sudden decline. In central Anatolia, the Hittite capital at Hattusa was destroyed around 1200 BCE, marking the collapse of one of the region's most powerful states. Contemporary records from Egypt refer to incursions by groups collectively labeled as the Sea Peoples, though the precise identity and origin of these groups remain debated. In western Anatolia, the effects of this systemic collapse are visible in the disruption of settlement patterns. Some sites show evidence of destruction, while others appear to have been gradually abandoned. The reduction in long-distance trade is reflected in the decline of imported goods and the simplification of material culture. This transition marks the end of the late Bronze Age system, characterized by interconnected palace economies and elite exchange networks. The collapse of centralized powers had direct consequences for the political structure of Western Anatolia. Without the overarching influence of the Hittite state, local communities were no longer integrated into a single imperial framework. Instead, authority became localized, with smaller polities emerging to fill the vacuum. Archaeological evidence from the early Iron Age indicates a shift toward more defensible settlement locations, including hilltop sites and fortified enclaves. This suggests an increased emphasis on security and regional autonomy. Linguistic evidence provides additional context for this transformation. The language later associated with Lydia belongs to the Anatolian branch of Indo-European languages, closely related to Luwian and Hittite. While written records in Lydian do not appear until much later, the continuity of linguistic features suggests that populations in Western Anatolia maintained cultural connections to earlier Anatolian traditions even as political structures changed. This continuity indicates that the collapse of the Bronze Age system did not result in complete cultural disruption, but rather in a reorganization of existing elements. By the beginning of the first millennium BCE, Western Anatolia had entered a new phase characterized by regional fragmentation and gradual cultural consolidation. The absence of large-scale imperial control allowed local identities to develop more distinctly. Settlement patterns, material culture, and linguistic continuity all point to the emergence of a population that would later be identified as the Lydians. This transformation was not immediate but occurred over several generations, shaped by the interplay of geography, resource availability, and shifting political conditions. The fertile river valleys continued to support agricultural production, while access to mineral resources remained a key economic factor. At the same time, reduced long-distance trade encouraged greater regional self-sufficiency. By the end of the 12th century BCE, the structures that had defined the Bronze Age world had largely disappeared from Western Anatolia. In their place, a new landscape had emerged, one defined by smaller, independent communities, each adapting to the conditions left behind by the collapse of earlier systems. In the centuries after collapse, identity replaced empire as the defining force in Anatolia. Between approximately 1200 and 800 BCE, Western Anatolia underwent a prolonged period of transformation following the collapse of late Bronze Age political systems. The destruction of centralized states, including the Hittite Empire, resulted in the disappearance of large-scale administrative networks that had previously structured economic and political life. In their place, smaller, localized communities began to reorganize around regional resources, kinship ties, and emerging cultural identities. Archaeological evidence from Sardis and surrounding settlements indicates that occupation in the Hermus River Valley continued without complete interruption into the early Iron Age. Excavations reveal continuity in settlement patterns, with domestic structures rebuilt upon earlier Bronze Age foundations. However, material culture from this period reflects a shift toward simpler construction techniques and reduced architectural scale. This suggests a decline in centralized labor organization and the absence of large governing institutions capable of coordinating complex building projects. Pottery assemblages from early Iron Age layers further illustrate this transition. Locally produced ceramics dominate the archaeological record, characterized by less standardized forms and simpler decorative motifs compared to the highly specialized wares of the late Bronze Age. At the same time, certain stylistic elements indicate external influence, particularly from Phrygia to the east and from Aegean Greek communities along the western coast. These patterns suggest that while long-distance trade had diminished, regional interaction networks remained active. Burial practices during this period provide additional evidence for changing social organization. Tumuli, earthen burial mounds, begin to appear in parts of western Anatolia, reflecting practices also observed in Phrygian contexts. These burial forms often contain grave goods such as pottery, weapons, and personal ornaments, indicating the emergence of social differentiation within local communities. The presence of such goods suggests that certain individuals held elevated status, marking the early development of hierarchical structures. Linguistic evidence supports the interpretation of cultural continuity amid political fragmentation. The Lydian language, attested in inscriptions from later centuries, belongs to the Anatolian branch of Indo-European languages. Comparative analysis indicates close relationships with Luwian and Hittite, suggesting that the populations of Western Anatolia maintained linguistic traditions inherited from earlier periods. Although written records from this transitional era are absent, the persistence of these linguistic features implies continuity in oral communication and cultural transmission. This continuity is significant in understanding the formation of Lydian identity. Rather than emerging as a result of sudden migration or external imposition, the Lydians appear to have developed gradually from existing Anatolian populations. Cultural practices, language, and settlement patterns evolved over time, shaped by both internal dynamics and external interactions. This process reflects a broader pattern observed across the Eastern Mediterranean during the early Iron Age, where new identities formed through adaptation rather than replacement. Records from neighboring regions provide indirect evidence for the conditions in Western Anatolia during this period. Assyrian texts from the early 1st millennium BCE refer to various Anatolian groups, though specific references to Lydia, known later as Ludu, do not appear until the 7th century BCE. The absence of earlier references suggests that the region had not yet consolidated into a recognizable political entity. Instead, it likely consisted of multiple smaller communities with limited external visibility. Archaeologists have also identified changes in settlement location and defensive architecture during this era. Some communities relocated to elevated or more defensible terrain, constructing fortifications that reflect increased concern with security. These developments are consistent with a landscape characterized by localized conflict and competition over resources. Without the stabilizing presence of a central authority, communities were required to manage their own defense and governance. Economic activity during this period remained primarily agrarian, supported by the fertile river valleys of western Anatolia. Evidence from botanical remains indicates continued cultivation of cereals such as wheat and barley, along with the domestication of animals including sheep and cattle. Metalworking also persisted, though on a smaller scale compared to the organized production systems of the Bronze Age. Finds of iron artifacts, including tools and weapons, reflect the broader transition to iron technology occurring across the region. The gradual adoption of iron had important implications for social and economic structures. Unlike bronze, which required access to both copper and tin through long-distance trade, iron ore was more widely available. This allowed smaller communities to produce their own tools and weapons, reducing dependence on external supply networks. As a result, technological capability became more evenly distributed, contributing to the rise of locally autonomous groups. Cultural interaction with the Aegean world continued to influence developments in Western Anatolia. Greek settlements along the coast, particularly in Ionia, maintained contact with inland communities through trade and exchange. Archaeological discoveries of Greek pottery in inland sites, along with Anatolian-style goods found in coastal regions, indicate ongoing interaction. These exchanges facilitated the transmission of ideas, artistic styles, and possibly social practices. Despite these connections, Western Anatolia during this period remained politically fragmented. No single authority dominated the region, and evidence points instead to a mosaic of communities, each with its own leadership structures. Over time, however, certain settlements, particularly those located in resource-rich areas, began to accumulate greater influence. Sardis, situated near fertile lands and mineral deposits, emerged as one such center. The concentration of resources in specific locations likely contributed to the rise of regional elites. Control over agricultural surplus, access to metal resources, and strategic positioning along trade routes would have provided advantages that could be converted into social and political authority. Archaeological indicators, such as the increasing presence of high-status goods and more elaborate burial practices, support the existence of emerging elite groups. This process represents a shift from loosely organized communities toward more structured social hierarchies. Leadership roles, initially based on kinship or local influence, began to take on more formal characteristics. While evidence for organized states is not yet present, the foundations of political organization were being established through these evolving social dynamics. The period between 1200 and 800 BCE can therefore be understood as a phase of gradual consolidation. Cultural continuity provided stability, while economic adaptation and regional interaction facilitated development. Over several centuries, these factors combined to produce a more cohesive population with shared linguistic and cultural traits. By the end of this period, the conditions necessary for the emergence of a unified Lydian polity were largely in place. Settlements such as Sardis had developed into regional centers, supported by agricultural productivity and access to resources. Social hierarchies had become more defined, and local elites had begun to exercise influence over surrounding areas. Before coinage defined Lydia, myth and lineage defined its kings. By the early 1st millennium BCE, Western Anatolia had begun to transition from loosely organized regional communities into more structured political entities. Within this evolving landscape, the Kingdom of Lydia emerged as a recognizable polity centered on the city of Sardis. The earliest phase of this political development is traditionally associated with the Heraclid dynasty, a ruling line described in later Greek sources as having governed Lydia prior to the rise of the Mermnad kings. The primary account of the Heraclid dynasty is preserved in the work of the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE. According to his narrative, the Heraclids ruled Lydia for a period of over 5 centuries, tracing their lineage to Heracles, a figure of Greek mythology. While this genealogy reflects mythological construction rather than verifiable history, it provides insight into how early rulers sought to legitimize authority. By associating themselves with a widely recognized heroic figure, the Heraclid kings established a form of symbolic continuity that linked political power with divine or semi-divine ancestry. The use of mythological lineage as the foundation for kingship was not unique to Lydia. Across the ancient Near East and Eastern Mediterranean, ruling elites frequently invoked divine descent or heroic ancestry to reinforce their legitimacy. In the absence of formal bureaucratic institutions or codified systems of governance, such narratives served as a unifying framework that justified authority and stabilized leadership. In the case of Lydia, the Heraclid tradition reflects an early stage in which political organization relied as much on cultural belief as on administrative structure. Archaeological evidence for this period remains limited, and no contemporary inscriptions directly reference the Heraclid rulers. However, excavations at Sardis indicate a pattern of increasing settlement complexity during the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. Structural remains suggest the presence of organized habitation zones, including residential areas, storage facilities, and early defensive constructions. These developments point to the gradual consolidation of Sardis as a central place of authority, likely functioning as the administrative and economic core of the emerging Lydian state. The geographic position of Sardis contributed significantly to its development. Located in the Hermus River Valley and near the foothills of Mount Molus, the city controlled access to fertile agricultural land as well as routes connecting the interior of Anatolia to the Aegean coast. This strategic location enabled the concentration of resources, including agricultural surplus and access to mineral deposits such as gold-bearing electrum. Control over these resources would have provided a material basis for political authority, supporting both local governance and regional influence. In the absence of extensive written records, the structure of Heraclid rule must be inferred from broader patterns observed in early Anatolian polities. Kingship during this period likely combined elements of military leadership, religious authority, and economic control. The ruler would have functioned as the central figure in coordinating defense, overseeing resource distribution, and maintaining relations with neighboring communities. Authority may have been reinforced through alliances with local elites, who managed smaller settlements and contributed to the overall stability of the kingdom. Material culture from this period suggests a degree of social stratification consistent with emerging political organization. Burial evidence, including tumuli and grave goods, indicates the presence of individuals with elevated status. These burials often contain items such as weapons, ornaments, and imported goods, reflecting both wealth and access to external networks. The concentration of such items in specific graves suggests the existence of a ruling or elite class that distinguished itself through material display and controlled access to resources. Contacts with neighboring regions further shaped the development of early Lydian political structures. To the east, the kingdom of Phrygia exerted cultural and possibly political influence, as evidenced by similarities in burial practices and artistic motifs. To the west, interaction with Greek communities along the Aegean coast introduced additional elements of exchange and cultural transmission. Archaeologists have identified imported pottery and other goods at inland sites, indicating that Sardis and surrounding settlements were integrated into regional trade networks. These interactions likely contributed to the formation of a hybrid political culture that combined Anatolian traditions with external influences. The adoption of certain practices, such as monumental burial forms or decorative styles, reflects a process of selective integration rather than direct imitation. This pattern suggests that early Lydian elites actively engaged with neighboring cultures while maintaining distinct local identities. Despite these developments, the Heraclid period appears to have been characterized by relatively limited territorial expansion. There is no clear evidence of large-scale military campaigns or extensive administrative control beyond the core region of western Anatolia. Instead, authority seems to have been concentrated within a defined geographic area, with influence extending outward through alliances and economic relationships rather than direct conquest. This relatively localized form of governance reflects the broader conditions of the early Iron Age, in which political entities were still in the process of formation. Without the institutional frameworks that would later define more complex states, early kingdoms such as Lydia relied on personal leadership, kinship networks, and control over key resources. The Heraclid dynasty, as described in later sources, represents an early attempt to establish continuity and legitimacy within this evolving system. Over time, however, the limitations of this model became increasingly apparent. As regional competition intensified and external pressures grew, the need for more centralized and adaptable forms of governance became more pronounced. The reliance on mythological lineage, while effective in establishing initial authority, did not provide the administrative or military capacity required to sustain long-term expansion or respond to emerging threats. The transition away from Heraclid rule is traditionally explained in classical sources as the result of internal instability culminating in the rise of a new dynasty. Herodotus recounts the story of Gyges, who overthrew the last Heraclid king, Candaules, and established the Myrmnad dynasty. While the details of this account are shaped by narrative elements, it reflects a broader shift in the basis of political authority, from hereditary mythological legitimacy to power derived from control of resources and military capability. This shift marks a significant turning point in the history of Lydia. The Heraclid period, though not well documented, represents a marhala of foundational development in which early forms of kingship and political organization took shape. Through the consolidation of Sardis, the emergence of social hierarchies, and the integration of regional influences, the groundwork was laid for a more centralized and expansionist state. With Gyges, power in Lydia shifted from inherited myth to strategic control. By the early 7th century BCE, the political structure of Lydia underwent a decisive transformation. The transition from the Heraclid dynasty to the rule of Gyges marked not only a change in leadership but also a fundamental shift in the nature of kingship and state organization. Unlike his predecessors, whose authority had been framed through mythological lineage, Gyges established power through direct control of military, economic, and administrative systems. The primary narrative of Gyges' rise is preserved in later Greek sources, particularly the account of Herodotus, who describes the overthrow of the final Heraclid king, Candaules. While elements of this account are shaped by literary tradition, the broader historical framework is supported by Near Eastern textual evidence. Assyrian records from the reign of Ashurbanipal refer to a ruler named Gugu of Ludu, widely identified as Gyges of Lydia. These inscriptions confirm both the existence of Gyges as a historical figure and his active engagement with the major powers of the Near East. According to Assyrian annals, Gyges initiated diplomatic contact with the Assyrian Empire during a period of regional instability. Records indicate that he sent envoys and gifts to the Assyrian court, seeking recognition and possibly military support. This interaction reflects a significant development in Lydian foreign policy. Rather than remaining a localized Anatolian kingdom, Lydia under Gyges began to operate within a broader network of interstate relations that extended across Mesopotamia and the eastern Mediterranean. The reference to Lydia as Ludu in Assyrian texts is particularly important. It represents one of the earliest external attestations of the Lydian state and indicates that it had achieved sufficient political cohesion to be recognized by distant imperial powers. This recognition suggests that Lydia, under Gyges, had moved beyond the fragmented structure of earlier periods and had begun to function as a centralized political entity with defined leadership. Archaeological evidence from Sardis supports this interpretation of increasing centralization. Excavations reveal the expansion of settlement areas and the development of more substantial architectural features, including fortifications. Defensive walls constructed during this period indicate a heightened emphasis on security and organized urban planning. These developments suggest that Sardis was not only a population center, but also an administrative hub where political authority was concentrated. The consolidation of Sardis as a capital reflects a broader trend toward territorial control. Under Gyges, Lydia appears to have extended its influence over surrounding regions, integrating smaller communities into a more unified political structure. While direct evidence of administrative systems is limited, the scale of urban development and the coordination required for defensive construction imply the presence of organized governance. Military activity played a central role in this process of consolidation. Greek sources describe conflicts between Lydia and the Ionian cities along the Aegean coast, including Miletus and Smyrna. These engagements were likely driven by a combination of economic and strategic considerations. Control over coastal cities would have provided access to maritime trade routes, enhancing Lydia's economic capacity and extending its influence into the Aegean world. At the same time, Lydia faced significant external threats from nomadic groups moving into Anatolia. Assyrian records and later Greek accounts refer to the Cimmerians, a group originating from the Eurasian steppe, who conducted incursions into Anatolian territories during the 7th century BCE. These movements created a volatile security environment, forcing established states to adapt to new forms of warfare and mobility. Evidence suggests that Gyges initially resisted Cimmerian advances, though the extent of his success remains uncertain. Some sources indicate that Lydia suffered setbacks during these conflicts, highlighting the challenges posed by mobile, non-state adversaries. The need to respond to such threats likely influenced the development of Lydian military organization, encouraging greater coordination and resource allocation toward defense. The interaction with Assyria may also be understood within this context. By establishing diplomatic ties with a major imperial power, Gyges sought to position Lydia within a network of alliances that could provide strategic advantages. However, Assyrian records later suggest that relations between Lydia and Assyria deteriorated, possibly due to shifting political priorities or failures in cooperation against common threats. This dynamic illustrates the complexity of early interstate relations, where alliances were contingent and subject to rapid change. Economic factors further contributed to the strengthening of Lydian authority during this period. Control over the fertile Hermus Valley ensured a stable agricultural base, while access to mineral resources, particularly electrum deposits, provided additional wealth. Although standardized coinage had not yet been fully developed, the accumulation and redistribution of resources would have supported both military activities and the maintenance of political authority. Material evidence from Sardis and surrounding areas indicates increasing levels of craft specialization, including metalworking and textile production. These activities suggest the presence of organized economic systems capable of supporting a growing population and sustaining elite structures. The concentration of such activities within key settlements reinforces the role of Sardis as a central node in the emerging Lydian state. The transition from Heraclid to Mermnad rule therefore represents more than a dynastic change. It reflects a broader shift in the mechanisms of governance, from legitimacy rooted in tradition to authority grounded in control of resources, military capability, and diplomatic engagement. Gyges' reign marks the beginning of a more pragmatic and expansion-oriented phase in Lydian history. This transformation can be understood as part of a wider pattern observed across the Near East during the early Iron Age. As older imperial systems collapsed, new states emerged that relied on centralized leadership and adaptive strategies to navigate a complex and often unstable political landscape. Lydia's development under Gyges aligns with this pattern, demonstrating how regional powers could rise through a combination of internal consolidation and external interaction. By the mid-7th century BCE, Lydia had established itself as a recognizable and increasingly influential state within Western Anatolia. Its capital at Sardis functioned as both an administrative and economic center, while its leadership engaged directly with major powers such as Assyria. Military activity, both defensive and expansionist, further reinforced its position within the region. In Lydia, metal became more than wealth. It became a system. By the mid-7th century BCE, the Lydian Kingdom had reached a level of political stability and economic organization that enabled a significant transformation in the way value was measured and exchanged. This transformation is most clearly represented in the introduction of coinage, a development that fundamentally altered economic systems not only within Lydia but across the wider Mediterranean world. The earliest known coins have been discovered in archaeological contexts at Sardis and other sites in western Anatolia. These objects are typically small, irregularly shaped pieces of electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver found in the riverbeds of the region, particularly the Pactolus River. Scientific analysis of these coins has confirmed that their metallic composition varies, reflecting the natural proportions of gold and silver in the source material. Despite this variability, each coin bears a stamp design, usually in the form of a simple punch mark or emblem. These stamped marks are of central importance. They indicate that the issuing authority, likely the Lydian state or its ruling elite, had verified the weight and authenticity of the metal. In earlier systems of exchange, transactions involving precious metals required weighing and testing at each point of exchange, a process that introduced inefficiency and uncertainty. The introduction of stamped coinage eliminated this requirement by providing a standardized unit of value recognized within a defined economic network. Archaeologists have uncovered a range of early Lydian coins, some bearing simple geometric punches and others featuring more recognizable symbols, such as lion heads. The lion, associated with Lydian royalty, appears to have functioned as a mark of authority, linking the value of the coin to the legitimacy of the issuing power. This association between political authority and economic validation represents a key development in the relationship between state and economy. The context in which these coins have been found provides further insight into their function. Excavations at Sardis, particularly in areas identified as commercial or industrial zones, have yielded concentrations of early coinage alongside tools, weights, and other indicators of trade activity. This suggests that coinage was integrated into existing economic practices rather than replacing them entirely at once. Over time, however, the use of coins appears to have expanded, gradually becoming a dominant medium of exchange. The availability of electrum in western Anatolia played a critical role in enabling this innovation. Geological surveys of the Pactolus River basin have confirmed that the region contains significant deposits of gold-bearing sediments. Ancient sources, including later Greek accounts, refer to the wealth derived from these deposits, though such accounts often exaggerate their scale. Nonetheless, the presence of accessible precious metal provided a practical foundation for the production of coinage, allowing the Lydian state to control both the raw material and its transformation into standardized units. The introduction of coinage also reflects broader changes in the organization of the Lydian economy. As trade networks expanded and economic activity became more complex, the limitations of barter and weighed bullion systems became increasingly apparent. Barter required a direct equivalence of goods, which was often difficult to establish, while bullion exchange depended on accurate measurement and trust between parties. Coinage addressed both issues by providing a universally recognized medium of exchange that simplified transactions. Evidence for the spread of Lydian coinage beyond its place of origin can be found in archaeological sites across western Anatolia and the Aegean. Early electrum coins have been discovered in Greek settlements such as Ephesus and Miletus, indicating that the system was adopted or at least accepted by neighboring communities engaged in trade with Lydia. This diffusion suggests that coinage was not merely a local innovation but one that quickly became integrated into regional economic systems. Greek literary sources from later periods acknowledge the Lydians as the originators of coinage. While these accounts were written centuries after the initial development, they are supported by the archaeological record, which consistently places the earliest coins in Lydian contexts. The adoption of coinage by Greek city-states in the following centuries further reinforces the significance of this innovation, as it became a central feature of Mediterranean economies. The standardization of value through coinage had important implications for governance. By controlling the production and distribution of coins, the Lydian state was able to exert greater influence over economic activity. This control extended to taxation, military payment, and trade regulation, all of which benefited from a consistent and portable medium of exchange. The integration of coinage into state functions represents an early example of monetary policy, in which economic tools are used to support political objectives. Archaeological findings also indicate the existence of minting facilities or organized production centers, though direct evidence for specific mint structures remains limited. The uniformity of certain coin types suggests centralized production or at least standardized methods of stamping and distribution. This level of organization implies coordination between political authority and economic practice, further supporting the view that coinage was a state-directed innovation. The transition to a coin-based economy did not occur instantaneously. For a period of time, coinage coexisted with traditional forms of exchange, including barter and the use of weighed metal. However, the advantages of coinage, particularly its efficiency and reliability, led to its gradual adoption across different sectors of the economy. As familiarity with the system increased, its use became more widespread, eventually transforming the structure of economic interaction. This transformation can be observed in the increasing complexity of trade networks during the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE. The ability to conduct transactions using standardized units facilitated longer-distance trade, as merchants could operate with greater confidence in the value of exchanged goods. This, in turn, contributed to the expansion of economic activity beyond local markets, integrating Lydia more fully into the interconnected systems of the Mediterranean. The development of coinage in Lydia represents a convergence of multiple factors: access to natural resources, the presence of centralized authority, and the demands of an evolving economic system. Each of these elements played a role in shaping the conditions under which this innovation emerged. The result was a system that not only addressed immediate practical needs but also introduced a new framework for economic organization. By the early 6th century BCE, coinage had become an established feature of Lydian society, influencing trade, governance, and regional interaction. Its adoption by neighboring cultures further amplified its impact, extending its reach far beyond the boundaries of the Lydian Kingdom. Trade turned Lydia from a kingdom into a network. By the early 6th century BCE, Lydia had established itself as a major economic and political power in western Anatolia. Its strategic location allowed control over vital trade routes that linked the Anatolian interior with the Aegean coast. These resources, combined with the kingdom's organized administrative and monetary systems, created a foundation for extensive commercial activity. Lydian rulers, particularly Alyattes and the early years of Croesus, leveraged this geographic and economic advantage to extend influence over the Ionian Greek cities along the coast. Archaeological excavations at Miletus, Ephesus, and Smyrna reveal evidence of Lydian interaction through imported goods, architectural influence, and occasional fortifications indicative of political pressure or oversight. Coins from Lydia have been uncovered in these cities, demonstrating that the standardization of currency facilitated economic integration across diverse polities. Trade goods in this period were diverse. Textiles, agricultural produce, metalwork, and luxury items such as finely crafted jewelry and vessels formed the backbone of exchange between Lydia and the Greek world. The standardized electrum coins simplified these transactions, allowing Lydia to operate efficiently across both short and long distances. Coins served not only as instruments of trade but also as markers of political authority, signaling Lydian oversight and legitimacy to partner cities and trading networks. Urban development in Sardis reflects the prosperity generated by these networks. Excavations show the expansion of public and administrative structures, including fortified citadels and storage facilities for surplus goods. Residential areas demonstrate organized planning, indicating that wealth accumulation was paralleled by increased social stratification and centralization of authority. This urban growth further reinforced the kingdom's economic and political dominance. The relationship between Lydia and the Ionian cities was complex, blending commerce with political influence. In some cases, Lydian rulers imposed tribute or exacted control through military presence, while in others, cooperation was voluntary and mutually beneficial. Greek literary sources and archaeological evidence suggest that this arrangement allowed Lydia to secure critical access to maritime trade while limiting the autonomy of coastal settlements. Control over trade also reinforced Lydia's regional prestige. By regulating the flow of goods, the kingdom could influence prices, dictate the availability of luxury items, and coordinate economic activity across western Anatolia. This control translated directly into political leverage, allowing Lydia to assert influence over territories beyond its immediate borders without relying solely on military conquest. Maritime connections extended Lydia's reach further into the Mediterranean. The integration of Ionian ports into Lydian trade networks allowed contact with the Cyclades, Crete, and beyond, facilitating the movement of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. Archaeological finds of Lydian coins and metalwork in Aegean contexts indicate that these interactions were both extensive and sustained, creating a web of economic interdependence. Military activity was closely linked to trade control. Periodic conflicts between Lydia and Ionian cities occurred when political or economic disputes arose. Such engagements were often brief and localized, suggesting that Lydia's primary objective was to maintain economic stability and the flow of tribute rather than to undertake outright conquest. The combination of economic dominance and strategic military presence allowed Lydia to secure its position without overextending its resources. Archaeological evidence also points to specialized craft production in Sardis and surrounding regions. Metalworking workshops, ceramic kilns, and textile production centers indicate that Lydia was not merely a conduit for trade, but an active producer of goods. These industries benefited from access to raw materials, skilled labor, and established markets, further reinforcing the kingdom's economic centrality. The integration of Lydia into the broader Mediterranean economy had significant social implications. Wealth accumulation supported an elite class whose influence extended across administrative, military, and commercial spheres. Elite households controlled land, resource extraction, and trade operations, creating a structured hierarchy that underpinned the kingdom's political stability. This social organization was essential for sustaining the extensive networks that connected Lydia to distant partners. Lydia's economic influence also facilitated cultural exchange. Artifacts indicate that Greek stylistic motifs and Anatolian techniques were combined in local production, reflecting the movement of artisans, ideas, and technologies. Coinage itself became a medium of cultural as well as economic communication, signaling political authority while circulating widely among diverse communities. By the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, Lydia had transitioned from a regional kingdom into an interconnected economic power. Its success relied not solely on territorial control but on the capacity to integrate trade, currency, and diplomacy into a coherent system. The kingdom's networks extended influence far beyond its borders, shaping the economic and political landscape of the Aegean and Anatolia. At its peak, Lydia faced an empire it could not outlast. By the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, Lydia had consolidated its territorial holdings and emerged as a dominant regional power in western Anatolia. Under the reign of Alyattes, the kingdom not only stabilized internally but also extended its influence into central Anatolia, fortifying borders and defending against incursions from nomadic groups, such as the Sumerians. Archaeological evidence, including fortification walls at Sardis and other settlements, supports the notion of a kingdom actively engaged in both defensive and expansionist operations. Alyattes' military strategy combined regional diplomacy with direct action. Greek sources suggest that he conducted campaigns to secure control over cities and trade routes, particularly those connecting Lydia to the Aegean coast. The consolidation of these routes reinforced the kingdom's economic foundation, while simultaneously projecting Lydian authority across Anatolia. In addition, Alyattes engaged in protracted conflict with the Median Empire, which controlled territories to the east and presented a formidable rival. The confrontation with the Medes reached its peak at the Battle of the Halys River, traditionally dated to around 585 BCE. According to Herodotus, the battle ended inconclusively, with both sides suffering significant losses. A solar eclipse reportedly occurred during the conflict, prompting a negotiated peace that established a clearly demarcated border along the Halys River. This event illustrates the practical limitations of military power, even for a kingdom at its zenith, and demonstrates the use of diplomacy as a strategic tool to stabilize frontiers. Following Alyattes' death, Croesus ascended to the throne, continuing his predecessor's expansionist policies, while also reinforcing Lydia's reputation for wealth. Croesus inherited a kingdom enriched by control of trade networks and the standardized coinage system, allowing him to maintain both military forces and administrative structures. Historical accounts emphasize his opulence, but this wealth was intrinsically linked to Lydia's strategic positioning and management of economic resources. Croesus' reign, however, coincided with the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Persia's expansion presented Lydia with a rival of unprecedented scale and organization. Croesus sought to form alliances with neighboring states, including Greek city-states and regional Anatolian powers, to counterbalance Persian advances. Despite these efforts, Persia's military capabilities and organizational efficiency ultimately outmatched Lydia's forces. The confrontation with Persia culminated in a decisive campaign around 547 BCE. Classical sources recount that Croesus initially achieved some tactical successes, including fortifying border cities and leveraging natural terrain to his advantage. However, the superior numbers and strategic coordination of Persian forces, coupled with effective use of siege warfare, eventually led to Lydia's defeat. The capture of Sardis by Cyrus marked the end of Lydian independence and the absorption of the kingdom into the expanding Persian Empire. Archaeological findings corroborate aspects of this narrative. Layers of destruction in Sardis correspond to the mid-6th century BCE, suggesting a violent conquest consistent with historical accounts. Inscriptions and subsequent Persian administrative records indicate the integration of Lydia into the imperial system, including the continuation of coinage production under Persian oversight. This transition highlights the dual role of military conquest and economic incorporation in the formation of large empires. The campaigns against Media and Persia also reveal insights into Lydian military organization. Evidence from fortifications and settlement patterns suggests that Lydia relied on both infantry and cavalry units, as well as mercenary forces drawn from neighboring regions. Coordination between military and economic resources was essential, particularly given the kingdom's extensive trade networks and reliance on wealth accumulation to fund campaigns. The Lydian experience demonstrates the limitations of even well-resourced and strategically positioned states. While control over trade, coinage, and regional alliances allowed for significant influence, the emergence of larger imperial powers introduced structural challenges beyond Lydia's capacity. Croesus' attempts to resist Persian expansion underscore the interconnectedness of military strategy, economic management, and diplomatic negotiation in determining state survival. Moreover, the fall of Lydia illustrates a broader pattern in the early Iron Age. Regional kingdoms could attain considerable prosperity and military strength, but they remained vulnerable to centralized imperial powers with superior logistical and organizational structures. Lydia's integration into the Persian Empire represents not only a loss of political autonomy, but also the extension of its economic systems into a larger imperial framework. Despite the kingdom's defeat, Lydia's military campaigns left enduring impacts on the region. Fortified settlements, the strategic use of rivers and terrain in warfare, and experience in coordinating trade-supported armies all contributed to the administrative and logistical knowledge that would persist under Persian rule. The kingdom's previous interactions with Greek city-states also laid a foundation for future cultural and economic exchanges under imperial oversight. The reigns of Alyattes and Croesus thus mark the apex of Lydian military and territorial power, illustrating both the potential and limits of regional states in the face of emerging empires. Their campaigns, successes, and eventual defeats demonstrate the integral relationship between economic strength, military capability, and geopolitical context in the evolution of early civilizations. Lydia did not collapse. It was absorbed by 547 BCE. Lydia faced an unprecedented challenge: the rising Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Croesus, whose reign had epitomized wealth and regional influence, now confronted a state whose resources, military organization, and strategic vision surpassed any rival in Anatolia. Persian expansion into Western Anatolia represented not merely a military threat, but a structural challenge to Lydia's autonomy and regional dominance. The culmination of this confrontation was the capture of Sardis, Lydia's fortified capital, an event that ended centuries of Lydian political independence. Classical sources provide varying accounts of the conquest. Herodotus describes a campaign marked by decisive maneuvers and the eventual fall of Sardis after a brief siege, though other sources note tactical retreats and skirmishes prior to the city's capture. Despite discrepancies, the consensus indicates that Persian forces exploited both military innovation and strategic patience. They combined swift cavalry operations with coordinated assaults on key fortifications, demonstrating the logistical sophistication of the early Achaemenid military. Archaeological evidence corroborates this narrative. Excavations in Sardis reveal layers of destruction dated to the mid-6th century BCE, consistent with a violent conquest. Burn layers, collapsed walls, and disrupted habitation levels indicate that the city endured significant upheaval before being reorganized under Persian administration. These findings align with textual accounts of a rapid and conclusive military campaign that established Persian control over Western Anatolia. Following the conquest, Sardis was integrated into the Achaemenid satrapy system, serving as an administrative hub for the Persian province of Lydia. This transformation illustrates a central feature of Persian imperial governance: the absorption of existing political structures and economic systems into a larger framework. Persian administrators retained much of the local bureaucracy, including tax collection mechanisms and resource management practices, recognizing the efficiency of Lydian organization. The continuity of these systems demonstrates that conquest often preserves functional institutions, even while political sovereignty is removed. The Lydian economy, especially its pioneering use of coinage, was adapted into the imperial system. Electrum and later gold and silver coins continued to circulate, facilitating trade and taxation across the newly expanded Persian territories. Lydia's monetary innovations provided a model for Persian economic administration, enabling the empire to standardize transactions over a wide geographic area and to integrate diverse populations into a single fiscal network. In this sense, the conquest reinforced, rather than erased, the significance of Lydian innovations. Croesus' defeat also illustrates the limits of military reliance on wealth and regional alliances. Despite extensive resources and fortified cities, Lydia could not match the scale and coordination of the Persian forces. Historical accounts emphasize Croesus' reliance on alliances with Greek city-states and neighboring Anatolian powers, yet these networks were insufficient against the centralized strategy and superior mobility of Cyrus' army. The outcome demonstrates how technological and organizational advances in imperial powers could outpace even the most prosperous regional states. The fall of Lydia had immediate and long-term implications for Western Anatolia. Politically, the region was reorganized under Persian oversight, with satraps administering territories formerly controlled by Lydian elites. Militarily, Persian garrisons secured key routes and cities, ensuring stability and the protection of economic networks. Economically, trade continued under imperial regulation, benefiting from Lydia's established systems while extending Persian influence into the Aegean and beyond. Culturally, the integration of Lydia into the Achaemenid Empire facilitated both continuity and exchange. Local traditions, including administrative practices, religious observances, and urban planning, persisted under imperial oversight. Archaeological evidence shows that while Sardis underwent restructuring, many Lydian urban features, such as the citadel layout and certain civic buildings, were maintained and incorporated into Persian designs. This reflects a pragmatic approach to governance in which conquest aimed to integrate rather than obliterate functional systems. The absorption of Lydia also exemplifies the broader pattern of Persian expansion. Empires that prioritized efficiency and adaptation over total destruction. By preserving existing structures, Cyrus not only consolidated his control but also capitalized on the expertise and infrastructure of conquered regions. Lydia's coinage, trade networks, and administrative knowledge became tools for sustaining imperial authority across Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean. The capture of Sardis marks a defining moment in the history of Lydia. Politically, it signifies the end of independent Lydian kingship and the incorporation of the kingdom into one of the largest empires of the ancient world. Economically and administratively, however, many Lydian systems persisted, influencing imperial governance and trade practices. The city's strategic position, combined with its pre-existing infrastructure, ensured that Lydia remained relevant within the Achaemenid system, albeit under new leadership. The fall of Lydia also underscores the complex relationship between conquest and continuity. While political sovereignty was lost, the mechanisms of governance, economic exchange, and urban organization were adapted and extended. In this sense, Lydia's innovations, particularly in coinage and trade management, continued to shape the wider region, demonstrating that defeat does not necessarily equate to cultural or technological erasure. By the end of the mid-6th century BCE, Lydia had ceased to exist as an independent kingdom, yet its legacy persisted in both Persian administration and the broader Mediterranean economy. The Achaemenid Empire utilized the structures established by the Mermnad kings, ensuring that Lydian contributions to governance, economics, and urban development endured well beyond the kingdom's political demise. Under Persia, Lydia became a bridge between empires. After the conquest of 547 BCE, Lydia was fully integrated into the administrative and economic framework of the Achaemenid Empire. Sardis, the former Lydian capital, was repurposed as a satrapal center, functioning as the western terminus of the royal road, which linked the city directly to Susa, the Persian imperial heartland. This route facilitated rapid communication, troop movements, and the transportation of tribute, embedding Lydia into the logistical and bureaucratic machinery of the empire. Archaeological evidence along the route, including way stations and fortified checkpoints, attests to its importance in maintaining imperial cohesion. The Lydian monetary system continued to influence economic practices under Persian rule. Electrum coinage persisted initially, and the Lydian model informed the development of standardized imperial currency, most notably the gold daric and silver siglos. These coins bore the hallmark of Persian authority while retaining conceptual continuity with Lydian innovations. Numismatic studies demonstrate that the consistency in weight, metallic composition, and stamp designs facilitated trust and efficiency in trade across diverse regions, illustrating how local practices could be adapted to imperial needs. Local governance in Lydia also showed continuity after conquest. Persian satraps often relied on established Lydian administrative personnel, integrating regional knowledge and expertise into the imperial system. Inscriptions and administrative tablets indicate that taxation, resource management, and urban oversight were coordinated through both Persian officials and Lydian intermediaries. This hybrid administrative approach preserved effective pre-existing structures while aligning them with the broader goals of the empire. Urban life in Sardis and surrounding settlements continued, albeit under new political oversight. Archaeological excavations reveal maintenance of city layouts, public buildings, and marketplaces, suggesting that the day-to-day operations of trade, craft production, and civic organization persisted. The retention of local infrastructure reflects a broader Persian strategy of pragmatic governance. Rather than imposing wholesale destruction, the empire absorbed functional institutions and repurposed them for imperial administration. Economically, Lydia's integration expanded the reach of its innovations. The royal road facilitated the flow of Lydian coinage, goods, and information across Anatolia and into Mesopotamia. Lydian economic practices, including standardized weights, market regulation, and trade networks, were effectively scaled up, forming part of a cohesive system that sustained the empire's internal and external commerce. The continuation and adaptation of these practices demonstrate that regional contributions could shape imperial operations in enduring ways. Cultural and social continuity also persisted. While Persian political authority was imposed, local traditions remained visible in urban planning, religious observances, and artisanal production. Sardis, for instance, maintained its civic identity while becoming a hub for cross-cultural interaction, connecting Anatolian, Persian, and Greek influences. Material evidence, including inscriptions, ceramics, and architecture, shows a blending of Lydian and Persian administrative and aesthetic elements. The integration of Lydia exemplifies the dual role of conquered regions within empires. Politically subordinate, Lydia nonetheless contributed significantly to the economic, administrative, and logistical frameworks of Persia. The city's strategic location, commercial expertise, and innovative systems made it indispensable for the functioning of the Achaemenid provincial and imperial network. In this sense, Lydia became both a beneficiary and a facilitator of imperial organization, demonstrating how local structures could shape broader geopolitical systems. Trade and communication under Persian oversight expanded Lydia's influence even further. The royal road enabled rapid exchange of information, allowing Sardis to function as a hub not only for goods but also for governance, intelligence, and diplomacy. Merchants, officials, and military personnel moved along these routes, circulating ideas and practices that reinforced Lydia's role as a connective node between the Aegean world and the Persian heartland. The persistence of Lydian coinage in these networks illustrates how local innovations could inform imperial policy and facilitate economic cohesion across vast territories. The Lydian example underscores the adaptability of imperial governance. Persian authorities relied on local expertise, economic structures, and logistical systems to administer diverse populations effectively. By preserving the core functions of Lydian administration and integrating them into the Achaemenid framework, Persia achieved stability and efficiency in the region while benefiting from Lydia's established innovations. This integration highlights how conquest does not necessarily erase local influence. Rather, it can amplify it within a broader imperial context. In addition to economic and administrative contributions, Lydia served as a model for urban and infrastructural development within the empire. Sardis fortifications, road systems, and civic layout provided a template for the integration of other satrapal centers, ensuring that the empire could leverage pre-existing regional strengths. Lydian experience in trade, taxation, and coinage informed Persian policies elsewhere, demonstrating the enduring impact of regional expertise on imperial design. Ultimately, Lydia's incorporation into the Achaemenid Empire illustrates a complex interplay between continuity and transformation. Politically subordinate, the region maintained significant economic and administrative autonomy within the satrapal system. Its innovations in coinage, trade organization, and urban infrastructure were not only preserved but scaled up to serve the needs of an empire stretching from the Aegean to the Indus. In this way, Lydia became both a conduit and a contributor to the Achaemenid system, bridging regional traditions and imperial objectives. The Lydians did not build the largest empire, but they built one of the most enduring systems. Lydia's most enduring contribution to world history lies not in territorial conquest but in economic innovation. The introduction of coinage in the 7th century BCE created a standardized, portable, and universally recognized medium of exchange. Prior to this development, trade relied on barter or weighed metal transactions, systems that were limited in scale and efficiency. By minting coins from electrum and guaranteeing their weight and value through stamped designs, Lydian rulers transformed how value was represented and circulated within and beyond their kingdom. Archaeological evidence indicates that the impact of Lydian coinage extended rapidly to neighboring regions. Greek city-states along the Aegean coast, including Miletus and Ephesus, adopted and adapted the concept of standardized currency. Numismatic studies show that early Greek coinage closely followed Lydian models, both in metallic composition and in design conventions. This adoption facilitated trade, enabling cities to expand commercial networks, accumulate wealth, and regulate markets with greater precision than previously possible. The implications of coinage extended beyond commerce. Standardized currency allowed for the more efficient collection of taxes and tribute, which in turn supported centralized administration and state-building efforts. Historians note that the Lydian system provided a model for later empires, including Persia and Rome, where monetary economies supported large bureaucracies and complex military logistics. Coins became instruments not only of trade but of political authority, reinforcing the legitimacy of rulers and their control over economic life. Lydia's innovation also reshaped social and economic relationships. Markets could now accommodate transactions between distant regions, facilitating specialization of labor and urbanization. Artisans, merchants, and agricultural producers operated within a system that allowed surplus production to be stored, exchanged, and reinvested. The standardization of value encouraged long-distance trade, integrating economies across Anatolia, the Aegean, and beyond. In this sense, Lydia's coinage laid the structural foundation for more interconnected and sophisticated economic systems throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Evidence from numismatic collections across the ancient world confirms the diffusion of this innovation. Electrum coins found in Anatolia, the Greek mainland, and the islands of the Aegean demonstrate both the mobility of currency and the speed with which new systems were adopted. Later, under Persian and Hellenistic administration, the principles established by the Lydians informed the creation of gold and silver standards, ultimately influencing the coinage of the Roman Empire. Lydia's model of trusted, standardized currency persisted, serving as a practical and symbolic tool for economic cohesion. The significance of coinage also lies in its role as a medium of cultural and political communication. Coins often bore symbols, inscriptions, or imagery associated with ruling authorities, communicating legitimacy, religious affiliations, and civic identity. Lydian coins, as the earliest known minted currency, exemplify the intertwining of economic utility and political messaging. This dual function was adopted by later societies, demonstrating the far-reaching influence of Lydia's system on both practical and symbolic aspects of governance. By enabling large-scale trade, taxation, and state administration, Lydian coinage contributed to the emergence of increasingly complex political entities. Cities and kingdoms could now coordinate resources more effectively, maintain standing armies, and sustain public infrastructure. The introduction of money transformed the scale at which societies could operate, facilitating economic specialization, urban growth, and regional integration. In this respect, Lydia's innovation is not merely a historical curiosity but a structural foundation for the development of ancient and modern economies alike. The spread of coinage also catalyzed intellectual and financial developments. Standardized currency required systems of accounting, measurement, and valuation, fostering numeracy and record-keeping. Contracts, debts, and financial agreements could now be quantified and enforced in ways previously impractical. Archaeological finds, such as inscribed weights and ledgers, illustrate the administrative sophistication that accompanied the adoption of coinage. Lydia's system therefore contributed not only to trade but to the broader development of economic administration and financial literacy in the ancient world. Although Lydia itself was eventually absorbed into larger empires, the influence of its monetary innovation persisted. Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman administrations maintained and adapted coinage for centuries, linking disparate regions through standardized economic practices. The concept of guaranteed value and centralized minting, pioneered by Lydia, became a defining feature of economic systems across the Mediterranean and Near East. Modern monetary practices, from national coinage to global currency standards, trace their conceptual lineage to this Lydian breakthrough. In sum, the Lydians created more than a kingdom. They created a system that fundamentally altered human interaction, trade, and governance. By inventing coinage, they introduced a durable mechanism for measuring, exchanging, and preserving value, a mechanism that continues to underpin global economies today. Their innovation demonstrates that even relatively small regional powers can leave legacies with global and enduring impact, shaping the trajectory of civilization long after political independence has ended. If you found this journey through Lydia's history fascinating, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into ancient civilizations. Hit the like button if you enjoyed learning how this small kingdom reshaped the world of money, and share this video to spread the story of the Lydians' enduring legacy. For the full historical experience, turn on notifications so you never miss an episode exploring the people, empires, and innovations that shaped our past.